Picture this. You're sitting there, agonizing over the exact right words to say. You are meticulously crafting the perfect text message, running through responses in your head, trying to build this bulletproof image of unshakable confidence. You really think that knowing what to say is the ultimate cheat code to getting respect, don't you? But here is the brutal truth. While you are intensely focused on your script, your actual value is quietly bleeding out in a much simpler, far more damaging way. Your status isn't being destroyed by some sudden catastrophic failure or public embarrassment. It is evaporating because your actions are constantly, predictably betraying your words. Listen, people can easily forgive a guy who makes one clear, honest mistake. We all understand human error. But a man whose behavioral pattern constantly contradicts his own claims, he becomes a ghost. He cannot be trusted. You aren't weak, and the system isn't necessarily rigged against you. You are simply transmitting a chaotic, mixed signal, and the world is quietly responding by downgrading its opinion of you. Today, we are going to dismantle exactly how this status collapse happens, and how you can stop it. To really get why this happens, let's peek under the hood at a psychological concept called cognitive dissonance, specifically from the observer's point of view. When someone interacts with you, their brain is like a supercomputer, constantly gathering data. It is listening to the words coming out of your mouth, but it is simultaneously watching what you actually do. When your verbal claims perfectly line up with your physical behavior, their brain registers a clean, congruent signal. Boom. Instant trust. It establishes a rock-solid internal frame. But when your words claim one reality, saying you're a high-value, unbothered guy, and your actions demonstrate someone completely different, you create extreme tension in their mind. The human brain literally hates this tension. It feels unnatural. It feels inherently unsafe. Think about it from an evolutionary standpoint. Our ancestors needed to predict the behavior of their tribe members just to survive. An unpredictable man wasn't just annoying, he was a dangerous liability. To resolve this uncomfortable tension today, the observer's brain takes the path of least resistance. It completely discards your verbal claims and accepts your visible behavior as the absolute, undeniable truth. And just like that, it immediately downgrades your perceived social value. You get categorized as unreliable. Your words become empty background noise. Now, the dopamine loop of validation addiction makes this trap incredibly easy to fall into. Saying you have high standards feels great in the moment, doesn't it? It gives you this quick, cheap rush of perceived status. You tell yourself and everyone else that you are a high-value man. But when you don't actually possess the discipline to enforce those standards, the intermittent reinforcement of your chaotic behavior reveals the cold truth. People realize your frame is just a fragile cardboard facade. You are projecting strength simply to hide a deep, exhausting reliance on external approval. Let's look at how this fatal inconsistency actually plays out in the real world. We all know a guy who does this, or maybe we've been this guy. The first and most glaring trap is the profound gap between talking about your standards and actually enforcing them. How many men loudly declare that they absolutely will not tolerate disrespect or low effort in their relationships? They post quotes about unshakable boundaries. They talk a big game with their buddies. I'd never put up with that, they say. But the second a real boundary is actually tested by someone they desire, their frame instantly collapses like a house of cards. They start making endless, creative excuses for the other person's poor behavior. They negotiate their own self-respect away, just to avoid the anxiety of losing the connection. This over-availability and intense fear of loss completely and utterly destroys their credibility. When you tolerate chaos while preaching about order, you don't look stoic. You look foolish. People do not respect a man who has to constantly remind them of his value. They respect a man who quietly demonstrates his value through his absolute willingness to walk away. Walking away power isn't a verbal threat you use in an argument. It is a behavioral reality. It is a switch you flip. When you complain about someone crossing your boundaries, but you never actually leave the table, do you know what you're doing? You are actively teaching them how to treat you. You are signaling that your words mean absolutely nothing, and your so-called boundaries are just mild suggestions. This creates a deeply low-value dynamic where your presence is completely taken for granted. Then there is the second scenario, which is honestly painful to watch. The tragic contradiction of claiming extreme confidence while actively fishing for reassurance. Picture a guy projecting a calm, detached persona in social situations. He's studied the mechanics of Stoicism, and he's doing his absolute best to mimic the posture of an unbothered man. But true detachment is about outcome independence, not just holding a blank facial expression like a statue. The contradiction always becomes glaringly obvious the moment the interaction ends. The exact same man who acted completely detached an hour ago will suddenly double text. He will over-explain his actions. He'll start seeking subtle validation, asking these indirect fishing questions just to confirm that the other person is still interested. This behavior exposes a severe validation addiction. It proves that his calm exterior was entirely fake, a mask constructed strictly to manipulate the outcome. A genuinely confident man does not need to constantly check the temperature of the room. He operates from a state of internal scarcity regarding his own time and energy. He knows his fundamental worth doesn't fluctuate just because a text message was delayed by 3 hours. When you claim to be highly secure, but your actions scream, "I'm anxious," the observer's brain instantly registers the deception. The mixed signal triggers a primitive kind of repulsion. In a split second, you transition from being perceived as a high-value challenge to being seen as an exhausting liability. The third crucial insight is a massive trap, especially in the modern self-improvement space. The stark contrast between preaching discipline and living reactively. We see this everywhere. A man consumes endless hours of content about building an elite mindset. He will talk the ear off anyone who will listen about his intense new workout routine, his hyper-optimized diet, or his grand, complex financial strategies. He essentially builds his entire identity around the idea of future success. But if you zoom in and observe his actual day-to-day life, it is governed entirely by impulse. He skips the hard work the second he feels a little tired. He reacts emotionally to minor inconveniences. He gets easily derailed by cheap dopamine and instant gratification. This type of man is in love with the aesthetic of discipline, but he absolutely hates the actual friction of execution. And believe me, the people around him see this glaring inconsistency in high definition. They see a man whose verbal ambition is lapping his physical reality. When you constantly announce massive goals that you never actually achieve, you aren't inspiring anyone. You are slowly, methodically destroying your own reputation. You are training the world to ignore you. A man with a truly cold, rational frame understands that quiet execution is the only metric that matters. He doesn't need to broadcast his intentions because his results will eventually speak for themselves, loud and clear. The gap between what you say and what you do is exactly where respect goes to die. Now, I want to address a very prevalent myth. You hear it everywhere lately. The idea that vulnerability and oversharing will somehow build a deeper connection and magically fix these inconsistencies. A lot of men actually believe that if they just deeply explain their internal struggles, people will understand and forgive their chaotic behavior. They think that constantly narrating their emotional state makes them appear more authentic. Let me be clear, this is a fundamental misunderstanding of human dynamics. A man without a solid frame constantly explains himself because he desperately needs the other person to validate his reality. He uses a flood of words to compensate for a drought of consistent action. Contrast that with a man who has genuinely mastered his internal mechanics. He doesn't over-explain his missteps. He doesn't demand that people understand his complex, tragic emotional landscape. Instead, he simply corrects his behavior. If he realizes his actions have contradicted his principles, he silently recalibrates. He understands a hard truth. Respect is never negotiated through lengthy emotional apologies. It is earned through undeniable behavioral consistency. He lets his newly aligned actions rebuild the trust over time. This approach requires immense emotional control. It requires you to stop seeking the immediate comfort of words and start doing the grueling, heavy lifting through your daily habits. So how do we permanently fix this destructive pattern? You can't just think your way out of it. You must implement strict, unshakable practices that physically force your words and actions back into perfect alignment. Think of these as internal guardrails designed to rebuild your frame by eliminating any space for self-deception. First, you need to conduct a ruthless audit of your own language. Pick one specific area of your life right now where your verbal claims are vastly outrunning your actual behavior. Are you constantly talking about leaving a toxic dynamic, yet you are still heavily invested and texting them every night? Are you preaching to your friends about financial control while secretly making impulsive purchases? Identify the exact point of contradiction. Once you find it, you must impose a strict gag order on yourself regarding that specific topic. You are no longer allowed to speak about your standards, your boundaries, or your intentions in that area. 0 words. Instead, you must replace your loud declarations with quiet, visible habits. If you want to establish a boundary, do not announce it with a dramatic speech. Simply enforce it the very next time it is crossed. Stand up and walk away. If you want to build discipline, do it entirely in the dark, where nobody can praise you for it. I warn you, this practice is incredibly uncomfortable at first. It deprives you of that cheap dopamine hit you usually get from talking about your goals. It forces you to actually endure the raw friction of reality. Second, you must practice the discipline of the delayed response. Inconsistency almost always happens because men react emotionally in the heat of the moment, blurting out things they cannot possibly back up with action. They make grand, sweeping promises out of guilt, or they issue intense, empty threats out of anger. You have to break this reactive cycle. When you feel the pressure to respond immediately to a test or a conflict, force yourself to hit pause. Do not let your anxious, racing mind dictate your words. Use this pause to ask yourself one cold, heavily calculating question. Can I actually execute the behavior that perfectly matches the words I am about to say? If the answer is no, or even maybe, you remain silent. You only open your mouth when you are absolutely certain that your physical actions will perfectly mirror your verbal commitment. This single practice completely eliminates the mixed signals that destroy trust. It trains you to speak with the heavy, undeniable weight of inevitable action. Listen, you have spent more than enough time trying to construct the perfect image through clever words and memorized scripts. and you have seen firsthand how quickly that flimsy image shatters when the actual pressure of reality is applied. The ego desperately wants to believe that what you say is more important than what you do, simply because talking requires zero actual effort. But the cold, hard truth is that your behavior is the only signal the world actually respects. Inconsistency isn't just some quirky personality trait. It is a fatal structural flaw. It exposes a man who is entirely dependent on external validation, a man who will eagerly compromise his own reality just to maintain a fragile connection. But you now understand the mechanics of this failure. You know exactly how the gap between your words and your actions actively destroys your perceived value. The absolute strongest move you can make right now is to close that gap completely. Stop broadcasting your value and start demonstrating it. Respect is never commanded. It is slowly and silently accumulated when your behavior makes your message undeniably believable. Take a hard look at your own life right now, with brutal honesty.
Where is your behavior betraying your script? And what exact steps are you going to take today to finally fix it?